I'm a historian, I apologize, so I'm going to start with a little story. In about 1933, Humphrey Bowman, the first director of education under the Mandate Authority in Palestine, sent a letter to the Colonial Office complaining about the lack of funds to the Directorate of Education in Palestine during that time. And he argued that the funds were needed for this reason. In contrast to the way that the British were going to educate Egyptians and Iraqis when they colonized those two countries, in those two countries, they educated a very small cohort and class of people to a very high standard. And he said, we failed miserably. Why? Because that small, highly educated cohort turned against turned against us. They became the core and central body that organized against colonial rule. They became nationalist leaders. And one of them, the most important figure, was Sata al-Husri, who became a pan-Arabist calling for the self-determination of all Arab peoples, and was one of the primary early authors of self-determined curricula in the region. Now, he argued, we can't do this in Palestine. It'll result in the same problem. And given the sensitivities of our presence there, our solution has to be one that is entirely different. What was his suggestion? We will educate and provide mass basic literacy for the peasantry, and absolutely not a scintilla more. They will know how to read, they will know how to count, they will know how to farm, and that is it. This resulted in a policy throughout Mandate Palestine where the purpose of education was to contain Palestinian knowledge, both production and acquisition. That set a precedent that was then followed by every single occupier and settler colonial power in Palestine. This includes the Israelis, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians to varying degrees. Each of these powers saw in the education of Palestinians the potential for rebellion against their rule. And so they sought to subjugate Palestinians vis-a-vis the educational system. And they did it in ways throughout the last 100 years that 60 years ago are just as familiar as they are in the images that you see from Gaza, for example, now. So at a very physical, violent level, school demolitions and bombings happened under the Mandate. They happened after 1948 within Israel. They happened in Jordan, and they happened in Gaza. School closures were instituted as collective punishment throughout the last 100 years. If a village misbehaved, one of the key things you did was shut down their school. You also will sometimes punish the village by banishing the teacher to the Siberia of that period. If, for example, in Jordan, where I work in, you send them to the deserts of southern Jordan to contemplate their bad behavior. You also, however, instituted structural form to the educational system. This began under the Mandate, where surveillance was instituted in every single classroom. Every classroom had a snitch, and every teacher had to report on any potential political mobilization against students. The threat was either imprisonment or banishment or execution. There's all sorts of stories and social histories about what that meant in terms of what the stakes were in demanding and seeking an education for the last 100 years. That this classroom was a very precarious place, but it was also a place of safety and a place where people, young people insisted on gathering despite these kinds of structural violences. More broadly, I think we have to understand the sort of the violence and attacks on, the historic attack on education as part of broader structural attacks on Palestinian life and sociality and politics. This is, creating populations of young people who are hungry, therefore they can't think, creating kind of a streaming of education wherein you force young people to make economic decisions as to what jobs or what educations they have to take up in order to feed their families. And this is why I want to say that it is so crucial to not just support any kind of education in Palestine, but it is, just as it is important here, it is absolutely crucial to support the humanities and the liberal arts in Palestine, because it is often those fields that are the least supported and the least valued because they lack economic opportunity, straight-laced economic opportunity. I want to go back to Bowman for a second. There's this great story that I found in the archive of a school teacher in Tulkerem, which is where I'm from, writing a letter to Bowman in 1937. And he tells him, look, my students, I can't keep them in a classroom. They keep leaving and they keep tearing up these train tracks, right? Let me tell you, listen, you have options. You either support their education and expand educational resources, or they're going to mess the entire country up, and I'm not going to be able to stop them. That, I think, perfectly encapsulates the role of the educator in Palestine. They were often the mediators between power and society in such a way that they served to articulate and build political consciousness amongst young people, while at the same time hanging the threat of insurrection at the door of the colonial power. So a teacher really has and had the social and moral authority to tell the kids, listen, we're not going to tear up train tracks today. Let's just chill for a moment, for a very long time. This deteriorated as well. And I think there's a scholar here, May Abu Mughli, who talks really well about how that social capital that teachers had gained throughout that 100 years of teaching against all odds, that now has become also a target of subjugation. And it's done in several ways. First, you threaten and you undermine the economic capacities of teachers. As you know, they keep going on strike because their salaries are utterly insufficient, and that means that they take up second jobs that compromise their social and political authority and their capacity to sort of lend political weight to conversations both in the classroom and outside it. It also means that they no longer have the time and capacity that they had historically to build alternative forms of schooling. One of the things that would always happen if there was closures, and this is in particularly was famously done during the first Intifada, and it's something that Roger might talk about, is that teachers would create informal spaces for education. In fact, one of the most moving things that I'd ever saw in the archive was that immediately after the expulsions of 1948, the first thing people did in the refugee camps was gather each other and start teaching young people. The first and last time Palestinians determined their own education and built their own curriculum was in the first 6 or 7 months after the Nakba, before international institutions recaptured them, and before the powers of the Jordanian, Israeli, and Egyptian regimes were consolidated. Those 7, 8 months resulted in a blossoming of experimentation by teachers who were so constrained by mandate educational demands and had not yet been incorporated into the ministries of education and the UN. That was a moment of a decolonial education realized and quickly and rapidly quashed. And you see glimmers, and you return and you see glimmers of it every now and then, if you look hard enough, in the way teachers create after-school clubs, the way they sit under trees with students during the first Intifada, the way they try to craft alternative spaces, even within the confines of a curriculum that aims to constrain their voice and their political will. And I just want to end by saying that one of the things that is often talked about in terms of Palestine is this trope of Palestinian education is the ultimate Palestinian success story. That Palestinians have nothing, but they are educated. Now, there's a history to that trope. It is not something that emerges out of nowhere, but it was also crafted as something particular. It began in the 1970s, and the main argument was, in deep irony, that the Palestinians are now so educated that they now deserve their state, because they now can rule themselves. And so one thing we must think about when we think about education is, what kind of education is a successful education? Is an education at all costs a success story? Or is it both something to defend, but also a recognition that it is a form of subjugation? And that, in fact, what we must defend is the right to a self-determined, self-crafted education whose goal is crafted by the people themselves. Thank you. Who's next? I'm going to hand it over to Roger now.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try and talk about what you asked me to talk about. I'm not sure whether you'll feel that you've been educated by what I have to say, but I think what's going on now is obviously very important. Let me just say thank you for your really original presentation. It reminded me, our 3 children, went for part of their school years to Palestinian schools in Ramallah. And at the time, this was in prehistory, before Oslo, and the textbooks were Jordanian textbooks. And Jordanian history, I thought it was very interesting because I've studied a bit of history, goes back infinitely far into the past. But the word Palestinian doesn't come up at that time in the 1980s in there. So there's a first level of censorship which had been imposed on Palestinian children. The second is that since Israel was in occupation, these books went through the Israeli censor. So many of the pages had simply been removed. So you had double censorship, which didn't in any way really prevent the good teachers and the students in general from looking and seeing through it, which is a little bit of what you're talking about. So you reminded me of the good old days and the bad old days, and so it was very interesting. So first of all, thank you very much to Fobzu and to the UCU for honoring us with this invitation, me. And before I continue, I would like to welcome and salute the presence of the advocate Emma Playfair in this room, who spent a decade working for Al-Haq in Ramallah and is still remembered and will always be remembered for the terrific work she did on behalf of the Palestinians in exposing the realities of lengthy occupation and also of struggling for the rights, right to education, among many other rights. And there she is. Thank you for coming. Anyway, so I was asked first to talk about our situation, which is part of a broader situation, and then I will try to explain how it fits into the structure and the movement of the structure of the occupation. I've been teaching history not quite as long as you said, but almost as long. We went to Palestine from Paris in 1983 following the Sabra and Shatila massacres of 1982, deciding to spend a little while living with the Palestinians. And so we stayed forever, and forever for the moment has been interrupted, and I'll explain why. So that has been actually 35 years. I was first working at Birzeit University, and then later, and since after that at Birzeit. Laura Wick, my wife, who's also part of the our exiled family. It's a golden exile, but it's an exile nonetheless, is a midwife, an educator, researcher in public health. Also, we both have contracts with, ongoing contracts with Birzeit University. So, obviously our children were raised there, and they've now gone and are living in different parts of the Middle East. So much for us. And what happened most recently was usually our visas are renewed by the Israeli occupation, which is headquartered north of Ramallah in a place called Beit El, based on the renewal of our contracts at Birzeit. And it happens, you know, we've had trouble in the past and so on, but this year, we were kind of boxed in to deciding what we would do. And many, many others are in the same situation. Educators, NGO, health workers, and so on. So this is something that concerns foreigners in general and therefore characterizes the occupation. It's not just that we were singled out. There's no reason to single us out. The last time we came in, after we'd been on a short trip abroad last May, a few months ago, we were given 2 or 3 weeks or 18 days or something, and then had to leave. So we said, but why did you do this? Oh, you just take care of it with the army. The army means Beit El. We tried to go to Beit El, and now they won't speak to foreigners anymore. This is also relatively new. And when I called up and said, look, you have to renew our visa, we have the new contract for 2018, 2019, they said, you can't talk to us, go to the PLO. Now, for somebody who knows a little bit of this situation, it's a very sort of, let's say, it's an ironic statement because they might have said the authority, but the authority, Palestinian Authority, actually has nothing to say, and this is since the time of Oslo and the signature, about who comes in and who goes out, who does not have a Palestinian ID. And therefore, all they do is you hand in your application and they send it along to the Israelis, and the Israelis just give you your visa. So that was it. So we had to decide when in May, June, we had to decide, would we do like what many others have done, and I'll tell you about them in a sec. I'll try to respect the 20 minutes, but either we left, and if we left, we didn't want to stay too long beyond the 3 weeks. We ended up staying an extra month because we emptied our apartments after 35 years. It's not so easy, threw away our stuff, and left. It was either that, and we hadn't been refused, we just had been ignored. We'd been given these, or stay and do what others have done. And which is to hire a lawyer. We have hired a lawyer, but from the outside, and appeal against this decision or non-decision that leaves you in limbo and therefore makes you illegal if you stay more than 3 weeks. And we couldn't do that. We didn't want to do that. We're too old. We have family abroad, and enough is enough. Because the others, and they call themselves the Birzeit 6, that's in addition to us, so I guess it's the Birzeit 8, and there are several others as well. The Birzeit 6, or maybe there are 7 now, went and have raised a collective, these people were turned down in their request for renewal. So it's a wave of either rejections, or as in our case, just, you know. And they have gone to the lawyer and have appealed. And as long as their appeal is running, because they're going to try and go to the high court, try to do this, try to do that, get the decision, say it's unjust, and it's up to the PA and the university to decide who works there and so on. And until their appeal has been dealt with one way or the other, they're not illegal. But they can't leave. Because if they leave, then it's a simple administrative matter to tell them they can't come back in. So they're there. And some of them have been stuck there for a year and a half. And even though most of them are Palestinians, actually, you know, they're foreigners and they're Palestinian foreigners. Almost all are Palestinian foreigners. Even though they're Palestinian foreigners, many of them, all of their family is in Chicago or in somewhere else, and they're stuck in Ramallah and in Birzeit. So this is a situation which has now affected dozens and hundreds of people. The figures are available. They're changing all the time. Every day there's something new. There's a group called there's a group called Right to Enter. Okay, and all of these statistics are available on our collective website, Right to Enter. It's in the dozens and the hundreds. It affects educators, affects human rights people, it affects NGOs, it affects all kinds of people. And there's the other category that is in some ways worse, certainly more poignant, and that is of spouses that are rejected. I'm sure you've heard of them. The family reunification, Lem Shemal, it's called in Arabic, that are being rejected massively. So they tell husbands or wives, usually wives, but some husbands, okay, here, you can stay 3 months this time. You go back and say, 2 weeks. Oh, you applied too late. You want, and so on. So this is the situation, and the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. So this is our situation in particular, which I explained to you at the request of our friends, and it is a situation which, and that's why I'm here, I guess, because otherwise I'd be there, because we should be still working there. I'll try to explain a little bit in the time that remains why I think this is the case. And certainly I agree with you that the denial of education is at the bottom of it, shall we say, culturally speaking. But I think there's also more of a political analysis. Going back, way back, a generation, 35 years, 30 years, I remember very well, and others do as well, that the situation was different in those days in terms of coming and staying and teaching and working and going away. In the 1980s, it was 70s, 80s, the Israeli occupation was a military occupation. Their concerns were security. And the military was in full charge of the West Bank. They still are at the top. The army, you know, they said when we went, go to the army. But they were in direct and full charge. And what they care about is what they call security, okay? So if you get in trouble on a security question, they'll go for you. But the rest, they didn't care that much about. Foreigners coming in, foreigners going out. Some of them sometimes had problems. Usually you could come in on a tourist visa, stay 3 months, go out, come back. Or we did it how many millions of times that way. Occasionally we would get a year's work permit. I would. Based on this, usually not, and say okay, and your phone was tapped, and you were under control. They didn't worry about you for a minute. They worried about fedayeen, right, and political organizing and stuff like that. They didn't want you to be working for the Democratic Front or something like that. But they, for the rest, they didn't. And young Palestinian men were not allowed to travel at the time because they would go over to Jordan or to Syria and train as fedayeen. So they, and women, it wasn't easy for them to travel. And men, young men, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, couldn't leave. So therefore, we served a purpose, and we helped in that sense. We helped the occupation because by keeping these schools running or by contributing, it's always under Palestinian leadership. We were simply, you're actually helping to maintain a stable situation in a tricky international and regional context. So it was tolerated, okay? So it was, although some people were kicked out, not kicked out, they're very careful, the Israelis, they don't usually do that, kept out, it was from time to time, and in general, what they would say is, what, you have little children, what, you want to come in? At the time, you could come in over the border from Egypt, from Jordan, from Haifa by ship, and from Lid airport by plane. And they would say, what, you're going to Ramallah? You must be crazy. Don't you know these people are terrorists and your little children? Well, if you're crazy, go ahead and do it. So that was more that. That was the situation then. It was a matter of military control and how to deal with a society that was under direct military occupation. Then came the first Intifada, and then came Oslo, we'll go through. And it continued to be that way during the Intifada. It's only that you could still go in and come out and you could leave from the different borders and so on. Even at the time of the Gulf War in 1991, the first Gulf War, flying in and out until they... Then came Oslo, okay? Now with Oslo, the Palestinians gained a degree of sovereignty, a very limited degree of sovereignty. But in exchange, the Israelis wanted to assert their remaining, their additional sovereignty, which is most of the rest of it. The Palestinians could deliver their own health and their own education and things like that. But the Israelis controlled the resources and they controlled the borders. And therefore, they began to be more demanding and more formalistic about who comes in and who goes out and on what basis and whether you need a visa and how long the visa will be for. And slowly, the Interior Ministry, which is responsible for things like that, you as a foreigner and until today in the West Bank are under the control of the Israeli military responsible for you. But the Israeli Interior Ministry is creeping into the picture to decide whether you go in or come in or not. So it became more and more difficult. So then came the second Intifada, and they were really mad. So beginning in 2004, they began expelling people seriously. And I was one of the first, but there have been many, many, many ever since. And now it's reached, and in the last couple of years, there's been a rise, an important rise in the number of people who've been kept out and who are denied and who have to leave or who have to stay forever and hide in Ramallah. Why? Why is it now the situation? It's not directly linked to education, although of course we know UNRWA and the UNRWA schools are under attack, the universities are under attack. This is an educational thing. I think it's a political issue. The nature of the conflict has changed. It was a directly political conflict until after the year 2000 sometime, where either war or peace were the objectives. You would negotiate or you would kill, right? So you would kill either, you know, it was war or peace. Peace as the continuation of war, or war as the continuation of peace. It was a political issue. And in that, of course, the Israeli military were preponderant on that. Now, this card has been pretty much put on the side, even though they're constantly looking for ways of negotiating and not negotiating on that. But the political relationship is no longer the primary one. Now, on the Palestinian side, is the time of what they call popular struggle. Of course, it's nonviolent, but they don't call it nonviolent, they call it popular struggle. And it's going on at two levels, at least, and many others as well. But it's nonviolent, and therefore the nature of the response is also a very different one. And therefore, there are no holds barred in this thing, people-to-people situation. You have the boycott, on the one hand, which has scared the living daylights out of the Israelis. I don't have time to go into more of why, and this isn't the place to do so, but they say it's a terrible thing, and who knows. But this is one, shall we say, one branch of the movement, of the popular movement, because we now entered this. And the other is, of course, the March of Return. So I believe that the reason why it's become more difficult for foreigners, and in many other areas as well, is that the political has turned into a social or a popular movement on both sides, so to speak. The Israelis are taking aim at individuals and no longer at states or PLOs or whatever it is. So that would be, that for me is the nature of the shift that explains why it has now become much more difficult. Even though it was always relatively difficult, now it's become absolutely difficult for educators and others to go and to stay and to work. This is the general framework. The direct operative change is, of course, Trump. Trump has two great allies in the Middle East, as you may not know. One is Saudi Arabia, and the other is Israel. Whatever Israel wants to do, they can do it. And Netanyahu knows that, and so therefore he does whatever he wants to do. Now, why it's so important for this man and for this woman and all these other people not to be there, who knows? If I were in his place, I'd be thinking. And as I say, there's a political military disagreement within the ranks of the Israelis. We don't know what it is exactly, but we see it at the airport every day when we read about people who are turned away. And one of our closest friends in Ramallah, when we left, it was a very tearful goodbye a couple of months ago. He said, "I'll see you again after Trump."